The act of the cult itself begins, therefore, with the pure surrender of a possession which the owner, apparently without any profit whatever to himself, pours away or lets rise up in smoke. In so doing, he renounces before the essence of his pure consciousness all possession and right of the property and enjoyment thereof, renounces his personality and the return of his act into himself, and he reflects the act into the universal or into the divine being rather than into himself. Conversely, however, the divine being in its immediacy also perishes in this act. The animal sacrificed is the symbol of a god. The fruits consumed are the living Ceres and Bacchus themselves. In the former die the powers of the upper law, which has blood and actual life. In the latter, the powers of the lower law that possesses in bloodless form secret and cunning power. The sacrifice of the divine substance, insofar as it is an act, belongs to the self-conscious aspect. That this actual deed be possible, the divine being must already have sacrificed itself in principle. This it has done by giving itself an outer existence and has made itself into an individual animal and into fruit. This renunciation, therefore, which the divine being has already accomplished in principle, is shown forth by the self who performs the sacrifice as an existent fact and for his own consciousness, thus replacing that immediate actuality of the divine being by the higher actuality that is of him, that of himself. For the unity which has resulted from overcoming the singleness and separation of the two sides is not merely a negative fate, but has a positive significance. It is only to the abstract being of the underworld that the sacrificial offering is wholly surrendered, and thus the reflection of possessions and being for self into the universal is distinguished from the self as such. At the same time, however, this is only a small part, and the other act of sacrifice is merely to the destruction of what cannot be used, and is really the preparation for the offering of a meal, the feast that cheats the act out of its negative significance. At that first sacrifice, the person making the offering reserves the greatest share for his own enjoyment, and from the latter sacrifice, what is useful for the same purpose. This enjoyment is the negative power which puts an end both to the divine being and to the singleness, and it is at the same time the positive actuality in which the objective existence of the divine being is transformed into self-conscious existence, and the self has consciousness of its unity with the divine being. Paragraph 718 is a long and very important, and in some respects, I would say, even intellectually beautiful one. Why I'm saying that, I'll tell you in just a bit. It's in part because of a responding to an analysis that I think is really on point on Hegel's part. And there's a lot of stuff happening in here that we need to trace out. So in this section, which is the abstract work of art, being finished up in this and then the next paragraph getting us ready to move into the second subsection of the second section of the religion portion of the work, we're talking about the cult, the Kultus in German. And this means a body of worshipers oriented around a god or gods. It's usually going to involve some narratives, it'll involve some sacred places, it'll involve rituals, it'll involve all sorts of things. What we're really talking about in this paragraph is sacrifice, which Opfer could be sacrifice. This is Aufopferung. And I want to pause for a moment on some terminological matters. He begins by talking about the act, the Handlung, of the cult. And we've remarked on this many times. Handlung is not well translated by act because that gives you the sense of something punctual rather than something repeated, something that may have an intentionality behind it at one moment rather than a lasting, perhaps even habitual intentionality. And when we're talking about the cult, especially in this context, as we're going to see, we're describing something that is not an action done once and for all, or even a repeated action, but an intergenerational, meaning developing action that is going on, using the cult as its locus and as its mode of mediation and reproduction. So behavior, comportment, ongoing intentional action, all those would be good translations of Handlung. And sacrifice, as I just mentioned, you could say Opfer, right? And that would be sacrifice in a certain sense. This is referring to the action or comportment of sacrificing for or towards or with something in mind. Aufopferung, right? So I think that there's a lot going on here that's revealed in and by the language. Another thing I'll mention as well is that he's going to use the word tun, which will also get translated as act by Miller. And usually the opposition is between not tun and Handlung, but tat and Handlung. Tun is the verb, right? And so there's something else going on here that we'll have to signal once we get there. So the cult is this unifying matrix. And what is it unifying? It's certainly unifying the body of worship, the individual human beings who come to it and engage in activity or in being shaped, transformed, educated within it. But it's also there not just as a training school or a body of beliefs that we should all hang out with. It has an object, and its object is the divine, the God. The cult is supposed to provide a place where one encounters the God and doesn't just encounter the God and say, "Oh, hi, God, nice to see you," or something like that, but has a really substantive, perhaps again, transformative of the self engagement with the God. And it's something that isn't just once and for all. You don't go to the temple just this one time. It's something that is repeated, if not in the individual's history, at least in the history of the family of the individual or the society that the individual belongs to. Remember, the ethical nation is what we're talking about here. So what's happening here? There's a tendency to look at ancient religion, especially if we're looking at it either from a contemporary atheistic perspective, which tends to flatten everything out and say, religion, that's all bad, right? Or if we look at it from the perspective of a religion that sets itself above all the other religions and says, these other religions all, maybe some things good in them, but they're all basically bad, right? Another way that we can look at religion, and Hegel does view things this way. I mean, Hegel is going to say Christianity is the ultimate religion, but then he's going to go beyond that. Another way of looking at religion is to say that, look, every human society develops some religious activities, concepts, behaviors, narratives. This is a vital dimension of human being. There's an incredible diversity between human beings when it comes to what it is that they worship or how they think things work, what the afterlife looks like. But there is this dimension which must correspond, if not directly to, spiritual entities in the sense of supernatural entities, certainly spiritual entities, geistige, right, in the sense of being things that take up headspace and play an important role within the fabric of human culture. So what is actually going on here? Do we need to look back at all of past history and be like, look at those stupid pagans, they didn't know what they were doing. They're bringing these sacrifices in and burning up some stuff and then, hanging out and getting drunk or doing whatever else it is that they're doing. And they think that they're actually like in touch with Ares or Demeter or pick whoever you want. We can adopt a kind of patronizing perspective in that way. Or we can say, wow, there must have been something there. Ancient people weren't stupid, right? And it wasn't just they were in the grips of some superstitious ideology, because there are, people at the time who are like, yeah, I'm not participating in this. And there were criticisms of people throughout everything as being, hypocrites, holding things back, right? Even in the most religious civilizations, we see that. So what's actually happening here? I think it can be helpful to think back to a previous long exploration of religion that took place in the self-consciousness section. Hegel called this the unhappy consciousness. And in the unhappy consciousness, there's a basic dynamic. The human being projects, and this can be the human being as an individual or as a member of a group, a society, projects the eternal, the essential, the divine outside of themselves and off into a beyond which they are then trying to relate themselves to, trying to connect back to. And they try, take after take on this, and none of them actually do, in fact, succeed in breaching that gap that lies between them. And, if we were just to stop here, then we'd have a good portion of, the later Hegelian Feuerbach, whose analyses of religion are, pretty on point for Hegel. But Hegel recognizes that something else is happening in the cult. And I think you can say that this is not just pertaining to the ethical nation par excellence for him, that of the Hellenes or Greeks. I think you can see this dynamic in religion after religion after religion, throughout the great world religions and in indigenous religions as well, including those that have managed to become world religions, like Zoroastrianism or the Ife religions. You could say that Christianity had an interesting success emerging out of the Jewish matrix as an ethnic religion and then turning into a vast missionary religion. So you can say a similar thing about Buddhism, can't you? So the cult becomes this place where mediation looks like it's genuinely possible. It looks as if we can have a giving and taking between the worshiper and the God that goes beyond a mere hunger or empty, endless desire on the part of the worshiper and basically non-response on the part of the God, other than do more, work more. In this case, there's a genuine back and forth, something like a relationship of hospitality, we might say. And, when you look at the Vedic religion and what some of the sacrifices are supposed to resemble there, it's like welcoming a guest in, right? You bring the gods in and you serve them things so that they will actually view you as part of this matrix of guest relations. So he starts, the act of the cult itself begins, therefore, with the pure surrender of a possession which the owner, apparently without any profit whatever to himself, pours away or lets rise up in smoke. What are we talking about there? If you don't know much about ancient religion, libations are pouring things out. These libations could be wine, they could be beer, they could be barley meal and milk, they could be milk and honey, they could be all sorts of things, right? In this case, he's going to talk about Bacchus and wine, but there's no necessity that it be that. It could even be spilling blood as well. There's that, and then there's getting rid of property, right? A possession, right? Let's rise up in smoke. The Holocaust, originally burnt offering. So people would bring in things to the priests in the temple, and the animal would be, have its throat cut or whatever else is going on, and some or all of the animal would be burnt up in smoke. That would, think about Greek hecatombs, right? Sacrificing 100 cattle. That's obviously not a sacrifice you can do every day, right? But they would take parts of it and they would burn it, and the smoke would go up to Zeus, who'd do whatever he's going to do. I mean, ask Homer what Zeus is doing with that. And it would be, the fatty parts and things like that. And this is understood as a renunciation, as giving something up without do ut des, I give, therefore you give. I give in order for you to give. It's instead, I'm giving this up because I acknowledge you, the God, are something greater, better, higher, more holy than I, and I want to connect with you, and this is the way that I can do it. So it's I won't say disinterested move, but he says in doing so, he renounces before the essence of his pure consciousness. Now this is important, the pure consciousness, right? Because we're going to see later on, well, consciousness isn't always quite so pure. All possession, right? Eigentum, and right of the property and enjoyment thereof, Genuss, is going to also return, and renounces his personality and the return of his act into himself. He reflects the act into the universal or into the divine being rather than into himself. And this is a way to do things, and we can understand this in many ways. The widow's mite in the Gospels, the widow who gives the tiny little bit of money that she can, she's not saying, oh, I'm giving this money and God will then shine upon me. That's not the point in doing it. She thinks, well, I'm gonna do this. I'm going to give it up for God, as we say. And people do this all the time with money, with possessions, with enjoyment, with enduring pain, with enduring, their people in relationships or coworkers or stuff like that. So there's this giving on the part of the worshiper that is really central here. Now he says conversely, so there's going to be a counter movement. The divine being, in its immediacy, also perishes in this act. There's a double movement here. This is very interesting going on. So first Hegel says, all right, the sacrifice or the worshiper is sacrificing, for example, an animal or fruits in this case, which would include grain. He's talking about Ceres and Bacchus, right? We get the word cereal from Ceres and bacchanalian from Bacchus, bread and wine, right? Is this a reference to the Christian Eucharist? No, not necessarily. It's not as if Christians were the only people to sacrifice grain products and wine or anything like that. Many people do this all over the place. It varies what it is. And then there's animals, right? And Hegel makes a differentiation here. He says, the animal sacrificed is the symbol of a god. So you don't just sacrifice any animal. You don't just go around and say, well, there's a lizard, I'll take that. You sacrifice the animals that have been prescribed in a certain way for that god. And the fruits consumed are the living Ceres and Bacchus themselves. Consumed. Now here we get to an interesting point. Consumed by what? Consumed by the sacrifice? Here's where we need to remind ourselves of the nature of ancient sacrifices. Priests would take the devoted animal, the devoted grains, wine, whatever else is being provided there, and then they would kind of divvy things out. So when you have a hecatomb, let's take one of the great examples of classical antiquity, that isn't just taking 100 cattle, cutting them up and burning the whole thing on the altar to go up to the gods, whether it be Zeus or Poseidon or whoever else. Most of the animal is actually going to be set aside for human consumption. This is why people, especially poor people, loved when sacrifices happened, because the rich people didn't get to just keep all the nice meat to themselves. It was shared, right? You might not only get a morsel or something like that, but that's better than nothing, ain't it? And other things, might be devoted to the use of the priests themselves, right? And so there's kind of this division that's going on and a re-sharing. So when the worshipers are consuming the bread and the wine, they are consuming the god, Ceres and Bacchus, right? Demeter and Dionysus. So he goes on and says, in the former die the powers of the upper law which has blood and actual life, but in the latter, namely the living Sirius and Bacchus itself, the powers of the lower law that possess in bloodless form secret and cunning power. So there's more going on here than just that, though. Here comes the second aspect. The sacrifice of the divine substance, insofar as it is an act, belongs to the self-conscious aspect. That this actual deed be possible, the divine being must already have sacrificed itself in principle. So there's symbolization and embodiment. We could say like a punctual thing. I symbolize now, or I always symbolize. And then there's this sacrifice, the Aufopferung of the divine substance, in the very provision, in the very connection to what one looked at as one's property that one is giving away without enjoyment. That was already the God's, and indeed, in a certain way, the God. The bread, the wine, the animal that you have and that you decide to renounce already belongs to the God, already is the God in a certain way, allowing you to sacrifice the God or a gift of the God to the God, to return it back, rather than looking at it as, oh, this is just my thing that I'm estranging from myself. So there's a shift in perspective that's going on here. Now, I mentioned lexically these two terms, deed and act, right? In this are tun, not tat, which is what Hegel more often uses. Tun is the doing. So this, again, shows something more like Handlung, right? A continual process rather than a punctual thing. Although it is not to say it couldn't be initiated by some primeval, the God did this at this point in time, therefore we use this animal for this God. Already accomplished in principle. So the divine being has already sacrificed themselves in the past, in a mythical past, we could say, is shown forth by the self who performs the sacrifice as an existent fact and for his own consciousness. So we return to the side of the worshiper and what's going on for them. This is a way of relating themselves to an agency, a divine agency, that is already in action and that precedes one's own action, doesn't just return in response, but has already responded long ago to you before you were even born into the religious community and initiated into it. So he goes on and he says, this replaces that immediate actuality of the divine being by the higher actuality, that of oneself, the unity which has resulted from overcoming the singleness and separation of the two sides, is not merely a negative fate, but has a positive significance. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. What God is this referring to? A little bit later on in the next section, and the section after that, we're going to have the divine pantheon. Here, though, what does he talk about? He says, it is only to the abstract being of the underworld that the sacrificial offering is wholly surrendered. Thus, the reflection of possessions and being for itself into the universal is distinguished from the self as such. So we have a bit of a problem here, and it's a two-sided problem, actually. The God that is being sacrificed to, turns out to be the abstract God of the underworld, rather than Apollo, rather than Ceres, rather than Athena, right? Or pick whoever else you want. On the side of the participant, the worshiper, the sacrificer, the entry into communion can also include holding a bit back. He doesn't use the words hypocrisy here, but I think we could say that there is this danger of hypocrisy at this point. So Hegel goes on and says, at the same time, this is only a small part, and the other act of sacrifice is merely the destruction of what cannot be used. Now, we're in bad shape in religion when people, instead of giving of their first fruits, giving of the best, they say, what can I give the gods? This crappy stuff over here that I don't actually need. I'll give them that, and then life goes on as normal. That's how religion starts to wither and die and turn into something that does, in fact, conform to the stereotypes of it by those who are critics of religion. So he says, the destruction of what cannot be used and is really the preparation of the offering for a meal, the feast that cheats the act out of its negative significance. So what's the negative significance? This renunciation. If you're giving because you're like, I'm going to sacrifice a bull, and man, I can't wait to eat those ribs or that liver. Well, actually, I think the liver would get burned and go up to Zeus, if I remember right. But pick whatever else you want, Can't wait to have those steaks or something like that. Well, you're not really in the right frame of mind at that point. Right? You're not really sacrificing to the god. You're more like arranging a feast, which isn't a bad thing, but isn't quite the same thing as a religious cultus. So he says, at that first sacrifice, the person making the offering reserves the greatest share for his own enjoyment, and from the latter sacrifice, what is useful for the same purpose. What's the first sacrifice is the animal, and then the other one is the fruits and the grain. If you're depriving the god, if you're not actually sacrificing, then in a certain way, you're being stingy and you're using the god's gift to the detriment of the communion with the god. So he goes on and he says, this enjoyment is the negative power which puts an end both to the divine being and to the singleness, the worshiper, and it is at the same time the positive actuality in which the objective existence of the divine being is transformed into self-conscious existence, and the self has consciousness of its unity with the divine being. So now this is interesting, right? This enjoyment has two sides. It could be an enjoyment of genuine communion that breaks through, or it could be the stingy enjoyment of getting my kicks, in which case you've got a negative here. So there is still a potentiality within the cult of a positive actuality in which the objective existence of the divine being on the side of the divine being, not on the side of the worshiper, is transformed into self-conscious existence. The God enters into communion with the worshiper rather than the worshiper simply with the static, available God, right? Hegel is describing here, as I pointed out, this is a very beautiful analysis of what goes on in ancient religions and why people might engage in this seemingly irrational practice of depriving themselves not only of enjoyment, but even their own property or their possession, their besitz, right? Why do they do that? Well, it's within the locus of the cultus, which provides the possibility not only of mediation, but of communion at that stage of consciousness.